Is the concept of God coherent? For 25 marks for AQA A-level philosophy. Here's how I would do this essay and some general tips about how you could do this essay if it comes up. In 2026, this is the one I am predicting will come up for Metaphysics of God in paper 2 for A-level philosophy. I've been wrong before though, I've been called out before, that is always the disclaimer. In fact, I've been called out specifically with this essay before because I said foolishly in a past year, many years ago, that this would never come up because they never asked it before, and then they did, which is a bit like applied ethics in ethics. So who knows if I'm right. If I'm right, then this video is maybe very valuable to some people. Otherwise, maybe it'll be valuable to other people in the future. Okay, enough preamble waffle. This might look like a scary, nasty, too difficult, massive essay question. This is actually a lovely essay question. This is a really nice essay question because you can almost just follow literally what is on the specification in order to answer this question. So just to run down again the specification material very quickly. Actually, I won't do this at length because I have this in, I think, multiple other videos by this point. But when you do this part of the A-level philosophy spec, you learn about the different attributes for God. Yeah, see another video if you want stuff on that. You learn about what eternal and everlasting mean as contrasting views of God's relationship to time. And then you learn about these three different ways of challenging three of the attributes in particular. So paradox of the stone for omnipotence, the Euthyphro dilemma for supreme goodness or omnibenevolence, and free will plus omniscience, which is about omniscience, but also to do with a certain conception of humanity or humans, a property of humans, and whether those things are compatible. So the obvious way to do this essay is to just first of all say, of course, yes, it is coherent, or no, it's not coherent. I will be arguing in my plan that it is coherent, and then do a very brief rundown, if you like, of what the attributes mean. To be honest, you don't even have to do that. You're only going to get 5 marks for AO1 in a 25 marker. You can show off all your knowledge of these attributes as you discuss potential criticisms of them or arguments about the question. So to be honest, I would even just jump straight in to arguments for the incoherence and analyzing those and not waste time, and then you can do those in sufficient depth, and then you just simply go through those arguments in the sort of the second set of transparent bullet points here, and analyze each one in turn. Maybe put the one that you think is most significant or interesting first, so that you spend the most time or your freshest energy in the essay arguing about that one, and then order the rest of them in descending order of significance. And you might even find yourself just talking about one of them, in fact, if you've got a lot to say about one of these. Remember, depth is fine over breadth. In some ways, depth is better than breadth in philosophy. If you have enough that makes sense to say about just one of these or just two of these, you could just do the essay on one or two of them. Or of course another one that's not here. That's riskier, that's bolder, but you might know stuff beyond what's just on the specification. As long as you're answering the overall question, that's absolutely fine. The only caveat I'd give though, if you do just focus on one or two of the arguments for the incoherence of the concept of God on the specification or not on the specification, I would maybe just flag to the examiner at the start, I'm just going to talk about this one because I think it's the most significant, or because it's the one that does demonstrate God's the incoherence of the concept of God, or what have you. Just maybe show them that you know about others if you choose to talk about one or two, because then that just puts their little mind at rest that you have actually studied the whole spec and you're making an informed, conscious choice. You're not just panicking and only talking about one because you're panicking. Yeah, so that's just a little trick to put the examiner's subconscious at ease. Flag to them that you know there are others and you're just doing one because you think it's important and most worth discussing in an A-level exam answer, if you choose that strategy. Though the straightforward, the blaggers, cookie cutter way to do it is just talk about these three. So how would I talk about them if I was going to do it? I'll take them in order. So I do not think the concept of God is incoherent. I think it is coherent. I happen to believe in God personally. I'm a person of religious faith. But even if I didn't, I think I'd still think the concept is coherent. It's one thing to say God doesn't exist, fine, that you don't believe in God, but it's another thing to say that the actual concept of a God doesn't even make sense as an idea, whether or not that being exists or not. And I personally think philosophically that people who think the concept of God is incoherent, basically that betrays a lack of imagination, to be perfectly frank. And yeah, they're incapable of admitting intellectually that this idea can make sense. I think it's a bit cheeky and ridiculous, to be honest, to say, oh, it's the idea of an all-powerful being just doesn't make sense, so one cannot exist. How do you know? There might be an all-powerful being out there. We have a concept of power. We have a concept of what it is to be a being. Just inflate them, just augment them, and you get an all-powerful, or at least a very, 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 very to the nth power, full powerful being. That's my take anyway. You don't have to agree with me, of course. It's philosophy. You can think what you want, but you've got to argue it. So how would I argue that about the specification criticisms? Well, the paradox of the stones. Remember the idea that, or the question really, could God create a rock so heavy that he could not lift it? One of the many so-called paradoxes that arise, logical paradoxes that arise from the idea of an all-powerful, omnipotent being. I think Aquinas' solution to this paradox is very good. Remember, that is that an all-powerful being is a being that can do all the things that are logically possible. Because it is not possible to create a stone that an all-powerful being cannot lift. It doesn't matter that God cannot do that because it is not a logically possible thing to do. So God can still be all-powerful under Aquinas' definition of all-powerful, able to do all logically possible things, and not create such a stone. Therefore, it does not show that God is not all-powerful. You might quibble with that and say that being able to do all logically possible things, and I suppose also not contradict his nature or change his nature, is not really being all-powerful. But it's a perfectly good definition for many people. Many people, myself included, are happy to take that as a definition. If you think that an all-powerful being should be able to violate, transverse the laws of logic, then why are we having this discussion in a philosophy essay? If they don't have to be bound by the laws of logic, then maybe the being can create that stone and also can not create that stone, and also they can lift it and they can also not lift it. And all of that makes sense because it's illogical. Wait, actually, well, all of that is allowed, even though it doesn't make sense, because an all-powerful being could break the laws of logic. If you want to go that route, you can also go that route, and by the way, defend the omnipotence of God. God can both do this or do both options in the paradox. You could try and argue because God can break logic. It's difficult to do though, especially in an A-level philosophy essay. It's much harder. There are of course philosophers who defend this position, such as arguably René Descartes thinks that God could break the laws of logic if you do a close reading of the first 3 ways of doubt at the beginning of the Meditations. So that is of course another route open to you to defend that or attack the incoherence of that and say that is the only justifiable definition of all-powerful, able to alter logic, make square circles, humans who are also donkeys, and so on. Personally, I think you're on shakier ground if you go that way, because how are you going to argue logically? Remember, philosophy is thinking logically about fundamental questions. How are you going to argue logically about such things as altering the laws of logic? You might want to do it though. More power to you, Teehee, if you're gonna go that route. I wouldn't though. I suppose someone might come back to me though, also by another route, and question my saying that it doesn't matter that God can't break the laws of logic, and say, hang on though, doesn't that make the laws of logic superior to God? Doesn't this make God answerable to the laws of logic if God has to follow them? Which, interestingly enough, links to the Euthyphro dilemma. That's a Euthyphro style problem, bringing us on to the second bullet point. Remember, the Euthyphro dilemma is, does God does God create the laws of morality, or does God follow the laws of morality? Or if you want it a different way, is what is good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? And each of those causes problems, remember, because if something is good because God commands it, it seems to make goodness arbitrary. If God commanded that cheating on philosophy exams was good all of a sudden, then that would make it good. Or if God commanded that rape, murder, eating babies, etc. was good, then that would make it good, according to the first answer, which seems highly counterintuitive and wrong. Could there really be such a possible universe where such things were good? So if you don't go that route, then you have to go second route, second answer to the Euthyphro dilemma. No, God commands it because it is good. And then you have potentially the same problem that I just outlined for logic, for when discussing the paradox of the stone. If God commands it because it is good, well, then you've got a standard of goodness that God seems to have to follow. But then is God really supremely good if there is something, as it were, metaphorically higher than God, by which God is bound, that God has to abide by? So in both cases there, God does not seem to be very godly or supreme, or again omnipotent. If God can't change the rules of logic, if God can't change the rules of goodness and moral goodness, is this really an all-powerful being? Is it really God? Is this being really supreme? Is it really the greatest of all beings? So yeah, similar. See how you can cast that logic problem in Euthyphro style terms. My answer to both of those, and to many, if not all, Euthyphro style problems, is also Aquinas's. You might notice a theme here. I'm not actually a Catholic, but Aquinas said a lot of very intelligent stuff. Usually, if you've got a philosophical problem, especially in the area of metaphysics of God, Aquinas has solved it, or at least thought very, very, very deeply about it, using the mind of a genius in the 12th century, a thousand or so years ago, or whenever he was around. So you can usually find an answer in Aquinas. Here's Aquinas's answer to both of those issues. So I'm kind of hitting both bullet points here. And to be honest, if I was doing this essay, I would tie these together. You don't have to. These are just ideas, suggestions, food for thought. Remember, Aquinas says the answer to these issues of God being seemingly answerable to these standards and thus below them and not supreme is actually that, yes, God is answerable to the standard, but the standard is not external to God and therefore metaphorically above him. The standard comes from God's being, God's self, or himself, if you want to use the gendered language, as Aquinas would. So in other words, there are rules of logic that God follows. There are rules of morality that God follows. But where do they come from? They're not metaphysically different or ontologically other to God. They come from the very being of God, which is the ground of all being. God has aseity. God just is in himself. God has always been around. They are in God's nature. They are derived from God's nature. That's easiest to see, I think, the argument with goodness, because, I mean, you see it in Anglo-Saxon English, right? The word God is not too far away from the word good. What goodness is comes from who God is. And if you wanted to get theological on this, if you're studying A-level RS, this might be familiar to you. You could say this has to do with God's inherent and intrinsic nature as a Trinitarian being, a community of love. God is love. God is three persons bound together in one substance, in a unity of love. That is what goodness is. Goodness is love in action. It's derivative of love. Therefore, when God commands, he only commands lovingly. It's not loving to eat babies, guys. It's not loving to, well, let's not be facetious. You do with those other horrible things I listed. Yeah, they are in contradiction of God's being. Therefore, they are not good things to do. That's where the standard comes from. It comes from who God is as the mysterious ground of all being and reality, the deepest rock bottom at the bottom of the universe if you keep digging and digging and digging. That's a theological view. That's a religious view. That's my view. I would defend it as coherent. Whether or not you agree with it, whether or not you think that being is real or not, another matter. I completely grant that. For that, you need other arguments for the existence of God. You need the possibility of miracles. You need, perhaps, according to my beliefs, the historical witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But my case here, do what you want with it, use it if you like it, or argue back with it, is it's not incoherent. It makes sense. It works as a defense. And then maybe slightly harder to see how it works with the logic problem, to go back to paradox of the stone. But Aquinas will help you there too. Aquinas would argue in the Summa that the rules of logic are set. They are necessary, but they are not external to God. Again, they come from God's being. They come from who God is. So God commands things, and it can only do what is logically possible, but that has to do with who God is in the first place, because the laws of logic are derivative of the original reality and being and nature of God. Maybe slightly harder to see that it works, see how that works. So, I mean, go and read some Aquinas or do a Google on this if you want more. But maybe I like to think of this in terms of maths and number. Yeah, so classic examples of the laws of logic are the truths of maths. 1 + 1 = 2 must be the argument that is most often used in the philosophy classroom, the A-level philosophy classroom at least. Or perhaps the three sides of a triangle add up to 180. So you can do this with maths. Could God make it so that 1 + 1 did not equal 2? No, because that is not a logical possibility. That does not follow the necessary laws of analytic of truth and maths. Why must God answer to this? Well, the whole nature of number and maths comes from the being of God, because God is, again, going a bit theological, 3 persons in one being. So the very possibility of distinction, of counting 2 related yet separate things as distinct from one another, adding them together and getting a new number, a new category of labeling numerically, comes from the fact that there is both oneness and threeness, creating the possibility of distinction and number in the being of God. There you go. So it's not that maths is above God, and God has to follow it, and logic is above God and God has to follow it, so he's not supreme. Maths and logic come from God. God is the supreme logical mind from whom all maths and logic comes. So pay attention to him. There you go. There's an Aquinas-style defense of the coherence of God in the face of this paradox and this dilemma. Finally, this is going on a bit, but I don't mind anyway. Hopefully it's useful to you. The compatibility or otherwise of the existence of an omniscient God and free human beings. Of course, this problem is drawing in humans now, so it's not just strictly the concept of God. Yeah, this is God plus a certain conception of humanity. And as you'll remember, it's in another video. I've got it revised in another video. The argument here is that if God knows everything, God knows the future. If humans are supposed to be free, but God knows humans' future actions, then that would seem to indicate that those actions are in some way fixed and determined. So when we arrive at them, there is not, strictly speaking, an ability for us to do other than we are going to do and other than how God knows we are going to do. So on certain conceptions of libertarian free will, that means that we can't actually be free. There is a fixed outcome which God is aware of. So there is not a genuine possibility of us acting one way or another when we come to our future decisions. That is the problem. There are lots of ways of dealing with this. Again, Aquinas has a way of dealing with this. Just to say, if you could show in an essay that you understand that this is bringing in humans and not just God, that would be quite a smart, clever thing to do, to signal to the examiner you really know what's going on here. Also, by the way, that would be a very sensible reason to exclude this argument from your essay, and you could flag that at the start. For example, if you did what I've just done on Paradox of the Stone and Euthyphro Dilemma in detail and kind of woven them together in your analysis, that might go on for quite a long time. It might indeed take you 50 minutes, an hour to talk about those, but then you could flag that you haven't talked about this third problem here on the spec, because it brings in humans as well. So that's why you're leaving it to one side, because you're strictly answering the question, is the concept of God, emphasis on God, coherent or incoherent, depending on how the question is phrased. So brief aside there, that could be a nice tactic. But anyway, I don't think personally this is an issue either. I know lots of people have problems with this. and get hung up on this, including atheist philosopher friends of mine. I've debated this at length in the pub with atheist philosopher friends. Shout out to Ben. But for whatever reason, it's just never really bothered me as a theist. I think it's perfectly possible that God can know the outcome of our future free actions. It's just that his knowledge isn't what determines the outcome of the action. It's our free choice. It's still the case that it could still be the case coherently that in the future I freely choose to do certain things, and it's me or it's my free choice that mysteriously decides what action is done. Of course, there are philosophical problems just with the notion of free will by itself, of course, and most philosophers are determinists. That's a matter for another discussion. I don't think you could necessarily fit that into this essay. But let's just say free will is a possible thing. If it is a possible thing, I do not personally think that it is ruled out or made impossible by God knowing the outcome of our future free actions, because the knowledge is not what is causing the action to happen. Yeah, it could still be the case, just as with my past actions, if I do have free will, that actions are chosen by me. I decide what to do, and then God has perfect knowledge, but not perfect determining cause of that action. He's not arranging it for it to be so. He just knows what it was in the past, and in an analogous way, he can know what they will be in the future, but that doesn't mean he arranges for them to be that way. Or to use the analogy, expand the analogy a bit further. Take present actions. I haven't come across many people who have the intuition that if I am free now and God perceives what I am doing freely now, then his knowledge of it somehow alters my ability to do an action now freely. So say I choose to speak a certain sentence now out of my own mysterious free will. I say it now, sentence, yeah? God saw me, perceived me making that choice and uttering that sentence. The fact that he perceived it and knew it did not take away its liberty, the fact that it was chosen freely. So in an analogous way, you can argue that God's knowledge of our future free actions is like that. God perceives it, God knows it, but God perceiving or knowing it does not mean that it is determined by God. And that indeed is the route that Aquinas and later Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann go down in order to explain how free will and omniscience could be compatible, bringing in a certain notion of God as eternal, borrowed from Aquinas and Boethius, of course, where God is outside of time and atemporal and sees our actions not as happening in the future, but as it were on a mountain looking down at the path, in an eternal present. So it's like God perceives them all in God's present as an omniscient, outside of time mind. And that deals with the problem, because you see how God knowing things in the present wouldn't change the fact that they are freely chosen in the present. So because our future is already happening in God's present, the present knowledge in eternity does not change the future freeness, let's say that, of the action. That convinces me, but to be completely honest with you, I don't think you even need to bring in the notion of eternity to make this work and make this compatible. In my mind, it already works if you just understand the difference, that the knowledge is not what is doing the determining. It is fixed in the sense that it is fixed that in the future I will freely choose something. That's all that's fixed. Just as in the past, it's now fixed that my actions, I freely chose something in the past. I know people disagree with me. I've had long arguments in the pub with this about this with people. By the way, one of the best philosophers I think who articulates my side of the argument here is Brian Leftow. He puts it this way: Leftow. If you had a Google, you might be able to find this somewhere out there. I remember coming across this when I was preparing for this essay for my university finals. Leftow argues, if you want a way of understanding this side of the argument, that God's knowledge of future free actions in this universe is analogous to God having perfect knowledge of an identical universe, parallel universe. So it's like if God knew everything that was going to happen and has happened and is happening in a universe identical to this one, but it's not this one. And again, for me, that is a useful thought experiment and illustration of how it could be possible that God knows the outcomes, but does not fix them. If you're still not persuaded, maybe we just have different intuitions. I have a strong intuition that it's possible for God to know future free actions without determining them, because it is fixed that in the future I will choose to do something freely, and God knows what that is. If you don't think that's possible, maybe we've got a different intuition. You can, of course, completely disagree with everything that I've said. You're disagreeing with Aquinas, though, so watch out, because he knew a lot of stuff. Make sure you've understood fully and properly the position that that you are disagreeing with when you disagree with it in a philosophy essay. Make sure you steel man it. Don't straw man it, steel man it. But yeah, basically, those are the things that I would say in a philosophy essay on this topic. You can, of course, talk about other things. You could even bring in the problem of evil, although again, that is bringing in a certain conception of the world and humans, probably, because you're going to get into free will defense and soul making if you talk about that. So I would personally leave it out, because the question does not obviously invite it. Discussion of the problem of evil, at least from the perspective of A-level philosophy. So that's a kind of a footnote. You can talk about evil if you want, because you can make it relevant. If free will and omniscience is relevant, then evil is relevant, because you're already bringing in stuff extra to strictly just the concept of God. But personally, I would leave it out and just use that for if you got the essay, does evil show that God does not exist, which is a topic for another time and a subject for another video. But yeah, hope that has been helpful to you. Of course, all that would remain at the end, having done that brief intro and then looked at some counter arguments to the thesis, or at least to the idea of the coherence of the concept of God, and then analyze them in depth, like I've just endeavored to do. Oh, by the way, just to mention as well briefly on the last one we were doing, compatibility of free will and omniscience. Remember, other routes, of course, simply to say that God doesn't know future free actions, and because that's not logically possible to know, God is still omniscient. Excuse me. So that could be another style of solution. That's how Swinburne would do it, and I believe Wolterstorff would go that way, and among others. And of course, you can also just say that we don't have free will, and that's fine. You could be a theological or an atheological determinist. You could be like most philosophers and think that we don't have free will. So the concept of God is still coherent with non-free humans, or the religious version where God determines everything that we do, and there is no free will, and God knows what we're going to do because He's determined it, like a hyper-Calvinist or someone like that. I don't like that position. I personally find it repugnant, but I know that there are people who hold it, and some of my I have acquaintances, at least I think, maybe friends, closet hyper-Calvinists out there perhaps. And I'm prepared to respect the position, and certainly the people I would respect, even though I don't agree with that position. Anyway, that was a sidebar. The final thing to do, of course, would be to wrap it up in a conclusion, a brief conclusion in which you don't say anything new, but you just sum up. Therefore, the concept of God is coherent or incoherent, depending on what the original question was. Remember, always answer the exact question in the term set. That's perhaps the most important thing. I should have said it at the start. So that's how you get the marks. Make sure you've answered the exact question, not a general question, not brain dumped a vague essay plan in the general area, but answered the exact question using the words in the question. Golden rule of all exams ever that you will ever do in your life, RTFQ, read the flipping question. Do that in the conclusion. Don't say anything new, just brief sum up in like even a sentence. One sentence conclusion is fine. It's coherent or it's incoherent, use the terms of the question, for this reason, and this reason. Or just this reason with a few qualifications if you went for a depth essay and not a breadth essay. And then, Bob's your uncle. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Please go home. You've got your A-level philosophy. You've got a good number of marks for this essay. Make sure you have the conclusion. If you're running out of time at the end, tie up the last point so you don't leave something hanging that disagrees with you, and write that conclusion, because you get marks on the mark scheme literally for just having a conclusion. And if you don't have one, the examiner will chop off some marks, so you need to have it there to satisfy the pedantic requirements of A-level philosophy. I hope that has been helpful to you, especially if you are one of the people who has paid for this video and bought it on Patreon. I hope you got your money's worth. All the best, good luck, care out there, and have fun answering this essay question to obviously say that, of course, the concept of God is coherent. All the best.